He's doing them. I can just watch. Today's speaker is Rosalie Stemmer, who is wire features editor at the Chronicle as well as editor of the Chronicle Foreign Service. She's taught copy editing in the communications department at Berkeley for 10 years and at Stanford for 5 years. And Don asked her to give us the best 55 minutes of those courses.
Loop this around my neck and then what?
And then reach up behind your neck. There's two little red things, and then pull them. Ah.
Okay. Can I be heard now? I've been editing copy for a number of years, as Tracy said, and I've edited copy at the Chronicle, and I've been a copy editor at the Kansas City Star and the Chicago Daily News. I want to tell you that even people who are supposed to be able to write well often don't write very well. And I'll show you some examples of that. This, now how will you see this? Oh, there's an overhead camera, okay. This is a headline that actually appeared in a Bay Area newspaper. Disabled fly to see Carter. And what the headline writer was trying to say was that handicapped people were flying to Washington, D.C. Here's another, this is a story from UPI. Can you read this? Doing what he loved best, golf pro Tony Longo died of an apparent heart attack Saturday while entertaining children at an epileptic charity show in Orlando. Now, these stories have been seen by a number of people. These stories and headlines have been seen by a number of editors before they get into the paper. But even good writing is very difficult and doesn't come very easily. There was one Bay Area daily newspaper that had a short story about a psychiatrist recommending treatment for his wife. And psychiatrist is a very long word for a headline, so the headline called him a dentist, just to fit it in a little bit better. What I thought we would do is go through an actual story that was given to me by a very experienced reporter and go through some of the reasoning an editor goes through in editing a story, look for some of the points of good writing and bad writing. Paul was going to hand that out. Do you all have that? Okay, why don't you take a minute? Yeah, why don't you take a minute to look through it, and then we'll discuss it page by page. Has everybody had a chance to look at this? Then let's start. The very first paragraph. 9 out of 10 books bought in this century by the U.S. Library of Congress, one of the great research libraries in the world, will self-destruct in 30 to 50 years. What's wrong with that paragraph? Go ahead. Please speak.
the thing that bothered me, at least when I read it, is that one of the great research libraries of the world, I thought, was talking about the 9 out of 10 books.
Yeah, you really don't have to define for the reader what the Library of Congress is anyway, do you? At least not in the lead of the story, not in the first paragraph of the story. And it can be confusing. Knowing what one of the great research libraries of the world modifies can be confusing. What about some other problems in the sentence? 9 out of 10 books. All you really need to say is 9 of 10, right? You don't need to have the out. Bought in this century. Does the Library of Congress buy books? Does anybody here know? I think that the Library of Congress gets a copy of every book that's published. Will self-destruct in 30 to 50 years. Well, this paragraph doesn't tell us how or why these books will self-destruct. The same problem, same as what? Same as what? Is plaguing, you could just say the problem is also plaguing university and other research libraries. What does that mean, other research libraries? I don't know. I saw someone shrug, and I don't know what it means either. And other research libraries throughout the world. You could just say the same problem is, you could say the problem is also plaguing libraries throughout the world, as well as fine book collectors. What does the fine modify? Book collectors? Or books? At a cost of millions of dollars. The cost of what? What costs millions of dollars? Well, you must see these problems here just as I do, looking through them. What else do you see in this sentence? To say nothing of. I don't know what that means. Maybe it means plus. I'm really not sure what that means. Next paragraph. Any problems with that? Yet many books several hundred years old are in excellent condition. Well, why? Why are they in excellent condition? Dr. Norman Schaefer, this is an error that's commonly made in attribution. Dr. Norman Schaefer, the Congressional Library's _S Director of Preservation, said yesterday, there's a long distance there between the subject and the verb. It would be better to say, said Dr. Norman Schaefer, comma, the Director of Preservation of the Library of Congress. But we still don't know why some are in excellent condition and why some books are self-destructing. The self-destructing books are victims. Can a book be a victim, do you think? Of technological changes in paper manufacturing and the increasingly acid condition of the atmosphere. Well, he means atmosphere. But he doesn't tell us why the atmosphere is increasingly acid, why it's becoming increasingly acid. Do you see anything else on the rest of this page? Any other problems?
Well, that sentence just read was passive voice, which is unnecessary there.
Yes, good point. Passive, it's absolutely best to avoid passive. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
So,
The paper and books made prior to 1850 and in many plants, we don't know what kind of plants, for some years later, probably means some years after, and I don't know why there's a comma there, was made of a base of linen and rags. And it resists the increasing acid content of the air, he said. But we still don't know why. This story was written by a very experienced reporter. And this actually is his second version.
Can I ask Jerry a question?
Yeah, please.
How much of this bad writing is due to his or her assuming that an editor is going to handle the bugs in it?
How much of the bad writing is due to what?
The reporter's assuming that an editor is going to look over it again.
The reporter should turn in the copy as well written as possible. The reporter shouldn't say, well, I don't have to do this very well because the editors will clean it up for me. The reporter should do a good job of writing.
But in practice, there are deadlines. And how, in your experience, do you get...
This gentleman had a week on this story before he handed it in, so it wasn't an immediate deadline thing. But it's a good question, and even at that, reporters try to spell words correctly and use correct grammar and write stories that read well. Okay, let's go to the second page. After 1850, paper manufacturers turned increasingly to the cheaper method of making their products from wood pulp and using acid-oriented chemicals in processing. What's the problem there?
cheaper than what?
We don't know. We don't know what it's cheaper than. That's a good point. Go ahead. Were you going to say something else? And what are acid-oriented materials? Why use them? Can you make paper without them? So far, the story is raising more questions than it answers, and good writing should answer the questions that a reader would have. One of your guest speakers told you that he asks himself how readers can misunderstand this sentence. That's a very good way of looking at it. You should, if you raise questions, you should answer them for the reader. Dr. Schaefer said his department is experimenting, misspelled, with deacidifying books by treating it. I know this is something you've discussed earlier in the class. There's no antecedent for it, although he probably means paper. Deacidifying books is plural, it is singular, with anti-acid chemicals. But this method requires a large vacuum chamber and is probably out of reach of most libraries. What's the problem here? What would be treated? The entire book, page by page, the paper? The singular antecedent in this paragraph is department. He says books by treating it. The antecedent is department. And when he says the method is out of reach of most libraries, why? Because of the cost? And he still hasn't told us the cost. Next paragraph, what problems do you see there? Another solution. Solution to what? Another solution. Solution to what? Lies in persuading paper manufacturers. Who's going to do the persuading? To make paper that is alkaline-oriented instead of acid-based. And here, once again, there's a long distance between the subject and the verb. Said Sally Buchanan, Stanford University's Director of Restoration. Would be a better way to say it.
Sounds like he really means a potential solution there rather than an actual solution. Or it's not clear whether this is actually being done or whether they just hope it will be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Good point.
Is it also a bad idea to use solution that way when you're also talking about chemicals?
Yes, yes. I'm glad you brought that up. It could be taken to have another meaning. And the next paragraph certainly mentions chemicals in a confusing way. Does anybody understand the next paragraph? What is he trying to tell us? If you can understand, what is he trying to tell us here?
He's just saying that alkalis and acids neutralize each other, and he's giving an example of an auto mechanic, I guess.
Well, you've put it much better than he did, I'm afraid, in his piece. One hopeful sign. What's wrong with that? I think you know what's wrong with that. You've discussed hopefully in this class. All right, the sign is not full of hope. Is that paper manufacturers, partly because conservationist efforts to preserve forests, are making. Once again, we have a very long distance between the subject and the verb. The subject is manufacturers, the verb is are making. Wood pulp, now used in most plants, more difficult to get in sufficient supply. It reads as if they're making it difficult for themselves to get wood pulp, or are conservationists making it difficult to get wood pulp. Very tough to understand the sentence. Okay, on to page 3. Now, this is really the form in which the story was given to me. Dr. Schaefer said one of the most encouraging things, he must mean signs, is the fact he has heard. Well, I think you could probably delete all that and just say Dr. Schaefer said one of the largest paper manufacturers in this country is now interested in new processes which are not wood pulp based and which would result in a more acid resistant paper. Several problems there. Can you tell me some of them?
The witches light up in red these days.
Yeah, both of these witches should be that. That's right, Tracy. And as I said, that all the words after Schaefer said could all come out. One of the most encouraging signs is the fact he has heard. All of that could come out. Often something that begins he has heard is a clue that those words could come out. Is now interested. Why is that paper manufacturer interested now? Will the paper manufacturer do it? Why wasn't the paper manufacturer interested before? And then he says would result in a more acid resistant paper. More acid resistant than what? Would it be acid resistant at all? And then he has this little asterisk here and says, this is Weyerhaeuser. Also have information of other studies which say new processes may be cost competitive with present methods. Well, you would think that he would just put that in the story, wouldn't you? Instead of writing a note to the editor saying, this is Weyerhaeuser. If he tells the reader a firm is interested, you would think he would tell the reader which firm. Do you have any other comments about this story? Anybody? It could be, and it should be. Is it something you're all aware of, that books are dissolving? Books here in the library?
My Like you said, it raises a lot of questions and
A lot
answers,
more
and now that I've
questions
read
than
this, I want to know what's really going on here and how I can keep my books from disintegrating. But
Well, good writing is very difficult, and it seems to me that the main goals of writing are goals you've discussed, to make writing clear, coherent, and accurate, and to make it tight. Concise writing is also very difficult. In 1657, Pascal said, "I have made this letter longer than usual because I lack the time to make it shorter." Writing tightly is very difficult, writing tightly and clearly. I have gone through your term papers, and by and large, I've found good writing. There were examples of some things that were common to several papers that I've recopied, and I'll discuss them with you. I was asked to read a report by a local software company, and your writing was much better than the writing of that software company. They made worse errors than you did. I noted some common pitfalls and some common errors. I singled out no one. As I said, I think the writing is good. And I chose errors that were common to several of you and things that might be helpful to others of you in the class, things that might be helpful to discuss. So here are some of these examples. I'm going to start with one that I think was an excellent topic. The student had a very good idea. She wonders whether her IQ is the square of the number of hours she slept. And her writing here is very nice. But let's go through let's go through the writing. Imagine a line that goes on forever. It may cut through your right thumb in a sidewalk cafe in Athens and the planet Pluto. That should be two separate sentences, to my way of thinking. With my pen in my mind, I have intruded everywhere. Who said I could do that? That's very nice writing. But once again, I think that should be two separate sentences. This leap from a few scattered points to a solid curve is only symbolic. This is something I want to discuss a little later, is the correct use of only, the correct placement of only. We just draw a solid line or a solid curve. A graph is never truly solid. There are infinitely many amounts of sleep I could get that are between 0 and 12 hours. To square each one and plot the result on a graph would be fairly tedious. Therefore, we opt for symbolism. That is, we just draw in a solid-looking curve. For a less symbolic flavor or just a different kind of symbolism, we could draw something like this, and then she has a graph there. She ends the sentence before the graph with the word this, and then the next sentence picks up this, like this. This makes it hard for a graph to forget its roots. Once again, I think this should be a period here with a capital I. Okay. We just draw a solid line. That's one just. We just draw in a solid-looking curve. I beg your pardon?
you counting justs?
I'm counting the justs, exactly. For just a different kind of symbolism and just a whole lot of points. That's 4 justs, which is something to watch for. I think some of you also have software that will look for this for you. And sometimes it's easier to write it and then look for it later. You know, if you know that this is a weakness of yours, sometimes it's easier to write it and look for it later. Once again here, when she says, the third paragraph, second sentence, we just draw a solid line or a curve. A graph is never truly solid. I think that should be a full stop, too, in a separate sentence. And after 12 hours, to square, I think should be a separate sentence, too. So what I wanted to point out here is there are 4 justs. The next paragraph is completely separate. It's on a different page. This is where the derivative appears. We have this graph, a series of points generated from a function. They look suspiciously like they would form a curve if we had them all in a line there, but no one is really sure. I think you could be more specific there. I think you could say they look suspiciously like they would form a curve. I think you could be more specific and tell the reader what the they is. If we had them all in there, I think you could say where, in where. And I wanted to point out the use of the word like. Have you discussed that at all in this class? Like governs nouns and pronouns. Before phrases and clauses, it's correct to use as if. So this should really be, they look suspiciously as if they would form a curve. Like can be used only to compare nouns. My chair is like your chair. They look suspiciously as if they would form a curve if we had them all in there. Was there a question? Okay, I thought we'd go on to the next one. The reason for removing. This was an example where we could save a little space, where we could save a few words. The reason for removing the spaces from the list is that. The reason for removing the spaces from the list is that we could say we remove the spacers from the list because, if this is correct, if the author is here and if what I'm saying is incorrect, please speak up.
That's right.
Good. Because all strings not separated by spaces should really be treated as single strings anyway. Now I wonder why we're saying anyway here. So, in the first part of the simplification, we will concatenate strings and remove the spacers. This, we could be more specific on that. This allows us to assume that all remaining strings must be separated. We'll again iterate through. Is there a better way to say that? Again, iterate through?
Well, again, we've been iterating a lot lately.
Uh-huh.
Again, it's just like saying, we're going to do this again and iterate through it. I think is pretty...
That's common usage.
Yeah.
Okay. The function that does this is pretty straightforward. I think in a case like this, it either is or isn't straightforward. And the other problem with using the word pretty is that the paper was about something called pretty printers. So you're getting into trouble, I think, using the word again. Also, straightforward is one word, not two.
In this one, you didn't complain about the semicolon in the third line.
Thank you. That's the next thing I was
Oh,
going
you
to say.
did?
I think this should be a separate sentence. And remove the spacers, period. This allows us to assume that all remaining strings must be separated. Maybe we should talk about the semicolon right now. It's overused. It's very much overused. If you do use a semicolon, the clauses that you connect should have a very close relationship. And don't use it if a full stop serves just as well. If the reader can stop and go on to the next sentence and it makes sense, don't use a semicolon. This is how I feel about semicolons.
Question?
Please.
But if the semicolon serves to point out a relation that the reader might not otherwise have seen.
If it's a close relation, it's perfectly valid. And there were some papers in which a semicolon was valid. Some of you did use it correctly. I will read to you what William Zinsser said in his book called On Writing Well. There is a 19th century mustiness that hangs over the semicolon. Use it with discretion, remembering that it will slow to a Victorian pace the 20th century momentum that you are striving for. As this gentleman says, if there is a close relationship between the clauses and you want to point that out to the reader, use it. If a full stop serves just as well, use a period. The next example really doesn't have much wrong with it. ly adverbs don't take hyphens. This is a small point of grammar. I don't think it really affects your reader's understanding. 99 times out of 100, it doesn't alter the meaning of the sentence. These constituents are tagged with locally unique identifiers. There should be no hyphen after locally. So they may be distinguished without relying on order. Then the next sentence, I'll ask you, do you see a problem with that next sentence? I have stripped out. For the sake of brevity. The problem that I have with that is for the sake of brevity. In presenting these metagrammar fragments for the sake of brevity, or is it not relevant for the sake of brevity? You could easily solve the problem by moving for the sake of brevity to the beginning of the sentence. For the sake of brevity, I have stripped out keywords, obvious list operators, operators with no constituents, and phyla that, it should be that, which you've already discussed, are not directly relevant in presenting these metagrammar fragments. Inheritance is spelled with an A. Do you have any comments about any of these points I've made so far? Professor Knuth assures me that you will ask questions, and I hope that you will. So feel free to jump in at any time with questions. Okay, the next one. In one of your handouts, I read that Mary Clara suggests reading sentences aloud. Due to restrictions imposed by the resolution of the graphics display monitor, when creating a single-page event tree which includes uncertainty parameters, the user is limited to 5 levels, i.e. 2 to the 5th equal 32 possible exit states. How could you improve that sentence? What would you do to improve it?
Well, if you can make more than one shorter sentence out of it, you'll probably win.
That would certainly help.
And let's see, someone recently cast suspicion on due to, but I don't remember what the replacement was.
Some people replace due to with because of, which is not always a big help. I think you need a subject right here. Due to restrictions imposed by the resolution of the graphics display monitor. I think right here you need a subject. Or if you were to eliminate that, you would need a subject right here. When creating a single-page event tree, which includes certain parameters, you would need a subject right here. Who is doing the creating? Who or what is being modified here? So the sentence seems to go on at some length without any subject. Which and that, I believe you've discussed. This which should be a that. If fixed branch point modifies option, you can hyphenate all that. Fixed branch point option. But once again, the same problem. If employing the fixed branch point option, now who or what is employing? You need a subject here. That is, no uncertainty parameters, the graphics display. Accommodate is correctly spelled. Accommodate is probably one of the most commonly misspelled words in the language, and I didn't see anybody misspell it in your term papers. Once again, in the next sentence, just about the same problem. In performing a Monte Carlo simulation of an event tree model due to restrictions imposed by the PDP 1173, the number, what you're saying here is that the number is performing the Monte Carlo simulation of an event tree model. So there's a problem with modifiers and subjects here.
It looks like the problem in this whole example is just to get rid of all the passive voice, or the solution would just be to change everything to active voice and figure out who's really doing what.
Yes.
In the very
yes,
first
that would
sentence, I would probably say something like, the graphics display monitor imposes restrictions or something.
That would be much better. That would be much better. Does the author have any objections to that? That would be.
Unless it was said in the previous sentence that's not in this excerpt, that there's probably a reason when you put it in context.
That would, taking the approach that this gentleman suggests, beginning with the active voice, finding the subjects, having a subject, verb, object format would help a lot, would certainly make it much clearer. And
I just have a little question. How come the numbers are in parentheses after the words, like 5, 5, and 7, 7?
I didn't hear your question. Could you say it again, please?
I'm just wondering how come after the words 5 it says parentheses and then the numeral 5, and same with 7.
Apparently the author's trying to clarify this for us. I don't know. I didn't take issue with the technical points, but I see what you after 5 paren 5 and after 7 paren 7. Apparently the author's trying to clarify this, but it doesn't seem necessary. And then the last sentence is the same. In beginning the discussion, it. What is beginning the discussion? Here, in beginning the discussion is modifying it. And beginning the discussion, what? We will briefly review. We will review briefly. Those statistical techniques and terms, that will arise in the context of the paper. The which should be a that.
Is in the context of one of those lovely little noise phrases, or
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. In the context
of... in the context of a noise phrase, or can it actually mean something?
It seems to me that the author had this in the beginning of the paper, and it may have been important to him. In answer to your question, sometimes it can mean something, other times it's noise. But it seems to me he had this in the beginning of the paper, and he wanted to establish this early and tell you he was doing this in the context of the paper. But if your point is that we could remove it from the sentence, and the sentence would be just as clear, that's a good point. Review those statistical techniques and terms that will arise. We could certainly remove that.
I have a question also. I know in newspaper writing you're supposed to have short sentences. Is that correct?
It helps. It helps in newspaper writing to have short sentences, but there's no rule that says you must at all times have short sentences. Some longer sentences read quite well, but you do aim for that.
I was just wondering if perhaps semicolons are more permissible in some writing, not in newspaper writing because it lengthens the sentence unnecessarily, but maybe in journal writing it's okay, or would you say that journal writing and newspaper writing are pretty much the same?
I think the concepts of clear writing and simplifying things for your reader are the same. I wouldn't say journal writing and newspaper writing are the same. I think the point that you raise about semicolons being used less in newspapers is very good. Newspapers try to be direct in reaching the reader, just make the point, get in and get out. There are times, as this gentleman pointed out, when semicolons would be helpful in newspaper writing or journal writing, probably less in newspaper writing. Does that answer your question? Okay, anything about these first 4 examples, or shall we move on to the next? Okay, what's the problem with the next sentence?
Singular, subject, plural verb,
Right.
passive voice.
Yes, thank you, all of those. Each of the delta z's is then multiplied by this factor. And passive voice, as this gentleman said. Also, several of you used the word then, and sometimes it's important to use it when you're describing a sequence. Sometimes it just seems to be a gratuitous word, or as you said, noise that's thrown in, maybe for the rhythm of the sentence. Each of the delta z's is then multiplied by this factor. Okay. Now we have a transformation that maps the symbol axis to a polygon in the z-plane. This polygon has the correct external angles at each of the vertices and has the vertex B1 in the correct position. It is unlikely, however, that any of the other sides of the polygon will have the correct length. In order to correct this, so we have a lot of corrects here that we could lose. I will also raise this question to you. This author is not the only one who did this. Here, B1 is set off with a comma, but there's no comma on the other side of it. And if you're making it parenthetical, you need a comma on the other side. It's so short that you don't have to have commas there if it's perfectly clear to your reader. But if you have a comma on one side, you need to have a comma on the other side.
I have a tiny little comment about that one. I think it would be an improvement to say at each of its vertices. And same number of letters, doesn't take up any additional space, and it helps.
At each of its vertices. Okay, good point.
This polygon has the correct external angles at each of its vertices.
At each of its. Good. That's more specific, and that will help us. Sure. Anything else about this? I didn't hear. Someone had a...
The it is, I mean, is that kind of, is it on referential it?
I'm still not hearing you. I'm
It
sorry.
is unlikely, however, that any of the
Yes, I'm glad you said that. I was hoping someone would. It is unlikely. What is unlikely? That any of the other sides of the polygon have. That's a word that could be improved. And this is done by comparing ratios. This refers to what? What is the antecedent of this?
Can you just give an example how you would change it is unlikely that blah, blah, blah? The fact that blah is unlikely. I don't really...
Well, do any of you have a suggestion for how you would change that?
Well, it depends on what comes next. It is unlikely that birds don't fly. Birds seldom fly.
Right, Tracy makes a good point. Sometimes you could delete the entire it phrase. It is unlikely, however. In this case, you can't. I think it's okay. I think the gentleman in the back...
In most cases, the polygon will not have the correct length or whatever. How about that?
I'm not sure that's the same meaning.
It's probably not an improvement either.
What if you began the sentence with the other sides of the polygon? What did you say? The other sides of...
I just said Tracy seldom have the correct length.
May not, or unlikely to have. May not have. That's another way to do it. I don't think it's terrible in this case, but the gentleman points out it, and it probably could be improved. The sentence probably could be improved.
I pretty much have the same question with the this is. I mean, sometimes a this refers to a really incredibly hard thing, or, the previous sentence, this method, or is that what you would prefer? I'm not...
The previous sentence
For
was?
instance, this is done by comparing ratios.
Yes, I was going to get to this is done by comparing ratios. One of your guest speakers told you that he had a professor who insisted that everybody remove the word this, and that he does it all the time. I understand that sometimes the procedure immediately preceding is very complex. You could say this process, this step, this formula, and if it is a whole procedure. In the sentence immediately prior, this sentence here, in order to correct this, I think in that case we do need an antecedent. It is unlikely, however, that any of the other sides of the polygon have the correct length. In order to correct this, to correct what? There I really don't know. And sometimes you're right, with a little bit of, if the reader extends himself a little bit, he'll know that this refers to the procedure, but why not help him and just say, this procedure, this is done by comparing ratios. So far we have only calculated 2 of the, and the next example that I have for you begins, these algorithms only consider the visibility of surfaces at discrete sample points. This one that I just showed you said, so far we have only calculated 2 of the components of the 3-dimensional velocity. What about the use of the word only? Have you discussed that at all? Let me show you some sample. The key to the word only is the placement. If we were to say, he saved 5 of the 50 people on the burning bus. That's a direct sentence. He saved 5 of the 50 people on the burning bus. What if we say, he only saved 5 of the 50 people on the burning bus? What are we saying then? It could be read to mean he merely saved 5 of the 50 people on the burning bus. For instance, you might say, I only want to be left alone. I only want to be left alone. He only saved 5 of the 50 people on the burning bus. He saved only 5 of the 50 people on the burning bus is the most specific of these. Now look at the second sentence. I only hit him in the eye yesterday. You're saying I merely hit him in the eye yesterday. I didn't do anything wrong. You know, don't gang up on me. I only hit him in the eye yesterday. So sometimes only has the connotation of merely, is what I'm pointing out to you here in this example. And if we look at the page that we were looking at before, if we look at the bottom of that page, the last sentence, so far we have only calculated 2 of the components. This is all we've done. So far we have only calculated this. I think what the author really means to say is so far we have calculated only 2 of the components, and there are more. Now we're going to go on to the others. So the important thing in the use of the word only is the placement of the word only. So that it doesn't mean merely. Okay, any comments or questions about these 5 examples that we just discussed? I know you don't have them all in front of you.
In that last one, is there a couple of these that can disappear? Well, that
There are a
last
couple of what?
sentence, where it's got 2 of the components, can we simply say 2 components? And for that matter, same thing back in the first sentence.
I still haven't heard you. Would you say it again, please?
In the last sentence there, instead of saying 2 of the components, can we just say 2 components?
Yes, that's a good idea. I should have seen that. So far, we have calculated only 2 components of the 3-dimensional velocity. Does anyone have an objection? Could there be more components than 3 in this? If there are 100 components, you might want to say 2 of the. If there are only 3, I don't see any problem with saying, so far we have calculated only 2 components of the 3-dimensional velocity. Does anybody see a problem with that? Okay. These algorithms only consider the visibility. We've discussed that. This is something I mentioned to you earlier. If the new tile is completely in front of all other tiles in the list, then it is added to the front of the list. Furthermore, if the new tile is a plain tile, then the rest of the list is immediately discarded, since all tiles in the list must now be hidden. Conversely, if the new tile is completely behind some plain tile in the list, then the new tile is discarded. Finally, if the new tile actually intersects some other tile or set of tiles, then a special file intersection structure is created. I think this is a case where the thens are what this gentleman referred to as noise. The author clearly presents the sequence, and I don't think we need the word then. Does anyone have any comment on that? Does anyone disagree?
Probably translated pretty
It certainly could be. It would make sense if that had happened. Well, then, yeah, it's a good thing for you to remove. If hidden surface modifies algorithm, you could hyphenate that. We therefore decided to look for a hidden surface algorithm. And this is something I mentioned a little earlier. While saving the extra computation for edges and intersections where the work is really required, as opposed to not being really required, our solution combines stochastic sampling with a depth buffer using the more expensive stochastic sampling only along surface edges and intersections where it is really needed. Well, is it or isn't it? You know, as scientists and technical writers, you need to be very specific in what you're saying. Is it really needed? Is it kind of needed? Is it sort of needed? Is it really needed? Just tell us as readers whether it is or it isn't. I think you need to be more specific there and more exact. Plane segments include only pixels. That's correct. That's the correct placement of pixels. The correct placement of the word only before pixels. That lie, that is correct. Entirely within the boundaries of the polygon. I think this should be a period and a full stop. Okay, any other comments about this paragraph?
How do you feel about the semicolon as a device to create a structure smaller than a paragraph, or do you just like short paragraphs?
Why do you need a semicolon to create a structure shorter than a paragraph?
I don't know whether you're taking this out of context. Maybe this appears in the middle of a long paragraph, and these two sentences are more closely related to each other than the one immediately before or the one immediately after. The semicolon serves a purpose there, and the only alternative I see would be to break up a paragraph into a lot of short ones, which also has its merits.
Break up a paragraph into a lot of short, what, sentences?
Paragraphs. Short paragraphs.
Break a paragraph into short paragraphs instead of using semicolons? I'm not sure I understand your point. If you're saying that the semicolons alter the length of the paragraph, I don't think they do. Whether you have a semicolon or not, the length of the paragraph...
A semicolon can show you that these two sentences are more closely related to each other because I put them together into one with a semicolon than they are to the immediately preceding sentence or the immediately following sentence.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you can.
Now another way to show that would be to break up the whole paragraph and to just make these two sentences a paragraph by themselves with a period instead of a semicolon.
Yes, that's possible too. If you need short paragraphs, you can break one paragraph into several short paragraphs. I think in this case, the second sentence reads out of the first just as well as the second clause reads out of the first with a semicolon. I don't think that the semicolon really helps there. Plane segments include only pixels that lie entirely within the boundaries of the polygon. These segments, it's perfectly clear.
But it might not be if if there's a sentence that's been omitted from right before this one that talked about some other segments.
I don't remember the exact context of this paragraph and what came right above it and what came below it. However, I don't think that what we're discussing is contradictory. You can shorten paragraphs by making one paragraph into two or more paragraphs. Semicolons may... I don't really think a semicolon will help you with the length of the paragraph. This sentence takes up just as much space, whether it has a semicolon or whether you break it into two.
I'm sorry, that wasn't my point, but it's a small point anyway, so just forget it.
Okay.
I got a question. I didn't really understand what you're saying about really.
I think, I'm glad you brought it up. I'm glad you said that. Would this sentence be changed if you said, while saving the extra computation for edges and intersections where the work is required?
Yes, I think it would. I think it would too.
This is really an artistic more than a scientific question. This is a little bit like advice from a house painter that says you have to be very careful along the edges of doors, but you don't have to be as careful in the center of the wall. So it might be saying, if you want to paint the room fast, paint the center of the walls quickly, but be very careful. You really need to spend time along the edges of the doors because that's where people will look. And that's essentially what that's saying in this paragraph. It's that kind of view. It's how to spend your work best in order to get the best results from the point of view of somebody who's looking at it.
I'm not sure I understand the analogy. If you tell me to really...
They're saying that at the center of a surface, you don't need to be very careful about how you do the sampling, whereas along edges, you do have to be careful. So you have to put in more work along edges, and they're going to take the work they saved in the middle and use it along the edges, whereas they put it, it's really needed.
Wouldn't you be able to say where... Look, in the first sentence, for instance, the one that begins, we therefore decided, wouldn't you be able to say, while saving the extra computation for edges and intersections where the work is more important? Or where the...
Or where it buys you more. There are a number of things you could say. I agree with you that those aren't very attractive sentences, but the really does contribute something substantively there.
Well, this...
Something only has to be said by really.
Where it is really needed. I understand your point that the really emphasizes something that we need to do more carefully, and I think there's a better way to say it than in close proximity to two sentences in close proximity both saying really. I think there's a better way to say it. What is another way that you would think of saying it other than using the word really?
I actually would add another phrase that says where the additional work contributes more to the visual quality or something.
That's much better. I think that would be much better. It's much more specific. I understand your point, and it's well taken, and I think your suggestion for improving it is much better. And the gentleman in the gray shirt, do you see what I'm trying to say? That you could be more specific and more exact than saying something is really needed, perhaps because really is so overused in colloquial language. Any other questions at this point? Okay. After defining a property that can be exhibited by an object, I don't know who or what is doing the defining. After defining a property that can be exhibited by an object, it is natural to look for simple ways to characterize objects that witness the property. Can an object witness a property? Are you saying yes?
Yes, where is the addition? I saw it.
I beg your pardon?
I thought there were certain parts of the site.
Where an object can witness a property? Okay, well that may be a technical term then. It certainly stopped me reading it. Does anyone else have any comment on that? In any event, after defining a property that can be exhibited by an object, I still don't know what's defining. It's not the it that's defining. This is not always possible. I think we need to say what this is. Alternately, we can think of a graph. I don't know really whether the author means alternately or alternatively. Alternately means by turns in alternate order. For instance, something that's hot and cold, or alternating current. Alternatively means with a choice between two or more things, either thing to be chosen in an alternative manner. And I suspect he means alternatively, but I'm not certain. I just raised that point. Note that G2 is essentially the same as what we define to be K2 when this happens. Now, what would you put there instead of this? When this happens. G2 is essentially the same as what we define to be K2 when this happens. I didn't hear you.
I might say when G2 equals K2.
Much better. When G2 equals K2. Much better. Okay, the next sentence. This is an odd number, but this sum has to be even since it counts each edge twice. Hence, there must be a vertex that satisfies A or B above, and this proves the theorem. What would you do there? The last property we'll state in this section, this is a well-known result. It's too many thises, and I think you could replace some of them. Maybe you don't want to replace all of them, but I think you can replace some of them. Are we running out of time? Are we near to the end of the class?
We have 1 minute.
Okay. I have this one other example here, but maybe if I leave it with you, you can go over it at another time. I want to show you a list here of words that are commonly misused because they look alike, but they have different meanings. That's this list. And some of them are words in common use, and some may not be common for technical writers. But I have copies of this list if you want it. if you want to take a look at that more closely later. Do you have any other questions that you want to ask me?
I want to see some prose where that's misused.
I beg your pardon?
I think it'd be entertaining to read prose where prostate and prostrate are misused.
I've seen it. I've actually seen that happen. I've actually seen that happen. And I also have a handout for you on repeating a noun several times within the same piece of writing, which I'll be glad to give you. So, does anyone have any other questions? Okay, thank you for helping me and explaining some of your technical writing to me, and it was a pleasure meeting you all.